The Commodore 64 computer was produced for 12 years, from 1982 through 1994, which is quite a long time, all things considered. And with a lifespan like that, there's inevitably going to be multiple different versions and variations. Over the years, I have acquired a grand total of 5 different Commodore 64s. Some of these are only slightly different from one another, and some are quite drastically different. I should mention that all C64s are compatible with the same software. It's just the way that the hardware is laid out that's different. So I figured I'd show you each one of my C64s and show you how the Commodore 64 hardware evolved throughout its time on the market, as well as some of the inconsistencies when it comes to C64 hardware. I will not be including the Commodore SX64, the PET 64, or the 64GS, because I don't have any of those, and if I did, they would be worthy of their own video. So let's start off with the oldest 64 I own, and that being this particular one right here. This is obviously going to be the older breadbin style, and it's called a breadbin 64 because it kind of looks like those wooden bread bins that some people have in their kitchen for storing bread in. It was never officially called that by Commodore. That's just sort of a name that people have given it over the years, and it's sort of stuck. Relatively early bread bin, judging by the date codes on the chips. It's not quite the very earliest variation of the 64, because the very early 64s had a silver label, and this is whereas this has the newer rainbow label, but this is a fairly early rainbow label, and it's still a fairly early 64. Now, the case for these early breadbin 64s is identical to the Commodore VIC-20, or more or less identical. The color is obviously different. Flipping the 64 over, you can see it's got a silver sticker on the back with a serial number. This particular one is made in Canada, so it's local, and apparently it was originally sold in Quebec because it's got this original sticker for the original retailer, which is really cool that this is still on there, although it is kind of drying out and peeling right at the moment. So let's open it up. 64s come apart pretty easily. There's just 3 screws along the bottom. You just need a Phillips head screwdriver. Now with the screws removed, we sort of tilt it upwards. It's going to click, click, click a little. And there's the inside. We'll disconnect the LED cable, and we'll disconnect the keyboard cable. And here it is. The insides of an early 64. So let's take a bit of a closer look at this motherboard. So here is the MOS 6510 CPU. This is the PLA. These are the ROM chips. These are I/O controller chips. The SID, or sound interface device chip, would go here, but the one in here, it died a while back, and I just pulled it out. The 64 doesn't have sound at the moment, but I have other 64s I can use that have working SIDs, so no big deal. I'll probably put a replacement in here at some point. And then inside this little box is where the video chip is hiding. And there, I just popped the cover off, and there's the video chip. This is not the original video chip to this 64. A bunch of the other chips are all dated like early 1983, but this video chip is dated 14th week of 1987, and it's an R9 video chip. This would have originally come with an R56A video chip, which was the first revision, which had some issues where like sprites and certain objects on the screen would sort of sparkle and shimmer, which was a common bug in the early 64s. And there we go, copyright 1983, Commodore, assembly number 250407, revision A. This one's, I don't know, it probably was like in a damp, it was stored in a damp environment, so it's a little corroded in places, but it all still works fine. So here's another one of my breadbin 64s. This one's a little newer. It's from around 1985, so it's from towards the end of the breadbin's time on the market. And this one has this HDMI cable sticking out the side of it. So what's with that? Well, you'll see when we open it up. But it's got an HDMI cable sticking out the side. Looking at the underside of this 64, as you can see, the badge is not in the center for whatever reason. Apparently a lot of North American 64s just have the badge stuck up here and not here. And this one is made in the USA. Opening this one up, as we can see, there are some things that don't exactly look period correct in this particular 64. That is because I have installed a Commodore VIC-2, which is an FPGA replacement for the original VIC-2 chip that both replaces the original VIC-2 as well as it adds some extra functionality to the video capabilities of the computer, including HDMI out. So I have like a cable running from the Commodore, and I can actually use this computer with HDMI on a more modern monitor, which is really cool. I may or may not do a whole video talking about, all the different things that the Commodore VIC-2 can do. It also does some other things like add some additional graphics modes to the 64. So the board in this 64 is not a whole lot different than the previous one I showed you, but there are a number of little differences, the most notable one being that the SID chip and the PLA chip have essentially swapped places. Just a few little components have been shifted around a little bit, mainly resistors and capacitors. But it's largely the same layout in terms of like chip locations and stuff. This one says copyright 1984, assembly number 250425. Something else you'll probably notice on the newer breadbin is there was no metal box around the VIC-2. But when I originally got this 64, and from the factory, there would have been a metal cover like this that would have went over a large portion of the board for RF shielding, because in the mid-1980s the FCC was really cracking down on electronic devices and radio interference. So the newer breadbin does have this thing that covers the entire board, whereas for interference reasons, whereas the older breadbin just has the VIC-2 inside a little metal box, and this other stuff's just out in the open. This is the main reason why I chose to put the Commodore in this particular 64, because it didn't have a little metal box around the VIC-2, which means there's lots of room to put the larger FPGA board in there. I would have had to rip this metal box out if I wanted to put it into here, so that would be a pain. So this 64 was the perfect 64 to put the Commodore into. And something different about this board is it can be switched between NTSC and PAL. As you can see, it's got some solder pads there which you can open and close to switch it between NTSC and PAL. There's one there, and there's one there. I should note that you will still need to replace the clock and the video chip. And the earlier board does not have these, so it's NTSC only. And the color of the solder mask on here is a bit of a more pleasing gold color, whereas this is a very dark green. As well as in this board, a lot of the chips are soldered directly to the board, whereas in this older board, pretty much all the chips are socketed. It can just be there's really not much rhyme or reason as to which 64s have which chips socketed. There's really, when you get a 64, some chips can be socketed and some chips won't be socketed, and which chips are socketed is really inconsistent. And some boards, none of them are socketed, and some boards, they're all socketed. It's just, ideally you'll get a 64 where most of the chips are socketed, but it can just be a total crapshoot as to, which chips on your 64 are socketed and which ones aren't socketed. In early 1985, Commodore would introduce the Commodore 128, which would feature a more sharp and futuristic design than the previous Commodore 64. When Commodore introduced the 128, they also still continued to produce the 64, but they did update the 64 to more closely match the design language introduced with the Commodore 128. So that brings us to the Commodore 64C, released in early 1986. It features a more futuristic and, at the time, modern design, and it matches the same design language as the C128. The C basically stands for cost reduced. For example, the 64 breadbin has this black metal plate in the side of the case around the joystick connectors as well as the power connector, and I'm not totally sure what purpose it serves, but the 64C doesn't have that. And the design of the 64C is a pretty radical departure from the brown blob design of the earlier breadbin 64s. As charming as the breadbin is, I'd say I prefer the look of the Commodore 64C. I also much prefer typing on the 64C. The keys and key mechanisms are exactly the same, but the keyboard is at a much more comfortable and ergonomic height and angle. So let's open up this 64C, and fun fact, this particular 64 is the very first Commodore computer I ever bought. second retro computer I bought, but it was the first Commodore one, and it was my first 64. And this one is my favorite, both because it's 64C and because it was the first 64 I ever had. And it's a longboard 64C, which is my preferred variation of the 64C. I'll explain in a sec what the difference is between a longboard 64C and a shortboard 64C. 64C is a little bit harder to take apart. I've unscrewed all three of the screws on the bottom, but it still won't pop open. That's because there's these tiny little tabs sort of in the sides that you have to push in order to get it open, and they're a bit of a pain. We're going to use a flathead screwdriver to push them in. Like that. There we go. And now it should open up. There we go. Another thing that's different about the 64C is that the keyboard is mounted to the bottom of the case instead of being mounted to the top part of the case. So in order to get to the motherboard, we're going to have to remove this keyboard. This comes out with two screws like so. Now I got the screws out, the keyboard should lift right out. And there we go. And now we have to remove that RF shield. All 64Cs have a big RF shield like this, and it actually is required. You need to leave this RF shield in your 64C because the keyboard actually sort of mounts to it. And this does actually double as a heatsink. So here's the inside of what is known as the longboard Commodore 64C. And it's called the longboard because the board is the same size as the board that is in the bread bin. It's got this big empty area. That's because the 64K of RAM, instead of having 8 8K chips, there's just these two 32K chips, and that's the entire RAM for the system, leaving this big empty area here. Other than that, this board is largely identical to the newer breadbin board that I showed you earlier. This particular board, most of the chips are dated 30th week of 1986, making this a very early Commodore 64C. Copyright 1986. Assembly number 250446. The Commodore 64C will be further cost reduced into the shortboard Commodore 64C around 1987. So this is a later 64C. And this is actually the newest 64 that I have. I've already unscrewed all the pieces because I was working on this the other day. Put together largely the same as the longboard 64C. As you can tell, the board is a lot smaller. Yep, that's it. So this is not just the Commodore 64 cost reduced, but I'd also say it's the Commodore 64 consolidated. So here's the short board in comparison to the long board. So it's about 1.5 inches shorter. So here I've got a board from a 1983 bread bin, and here I've got a board from my 1987 shortboard 64C. As you can see, a lot of things have been consolidated. First off, the RAM. Like on the long board, it's just these two chips now. A whole bunch of these other chips up here, plus this chip, the PLA, have been consolidated into this one big chip here. Here's the CPU. Here's the ROMs. They've been consolidated. There's 2 ROM chips on here, 3 ROM chips on there. Here's one of the I/O chips, 6526. And there's still 2 of them, but the other one's over here. Whereas on the older boards, the 2 6526s were right next to each other, up in the top left-hand corner. On here, they're both on opposite ends of the board. This means that they didn't have to run traces from like the controller ports and whatnot all the way over to this end of the board. And the keyboard connector is over here instead of up here. So how can you tell if you have a longboard 64C or a shortboard 64C without opening it up? One of the more obvious clues would be the keys. As you can see on this early longboard 64C, it has the Petsky graphics characters printed on the front of the keys, just like on the breadbin, and it uses the same font on the keys as the 64 breadbin. So the keys are exactly the same as the breadbin, just different color. On this shortboard 64C here, if you look at the keys, it has the Petsky graphics characters printed on the top of the keys along with the letters. As you can see, they're nothing printed on the front. And the font used on the keyboard is a bit different. So that can give you a clue as to whether a 64C is a longboard or a shortboard. That's not always perfect, since there are some exceptions, such as this 64 right here. This is actually a longboard 64C, despite having the Petsky characters printed on the top of the keys and the different font. So there was some overlap, and there are some cases where, there are longboards with it printed on the top of the keys, and there may even be some shortboards which shipped with keyboards with the graphics characters printed on the front of the keys. There's also the chance that this 64 had the board swapped at one point, although I can't really confirm that, and Commodore wasn't exactly known for being consistent when it came to, their hardware, so they just sort of threw together whatever they had laying around. So there is a pretty good chance that this is a longboard that came from the factory with the newer style keyboard. They probably just had a few of the older style boards laying around. So you can't totally go by the keyboard, because I actually bought this 64 thinking it was a short board, but it actually turned out to be a long board. So a more surefire way of figuring out if you have a longboard 64C or a shortboard 64C is by looking into the cartridge port and looking at this fuse here. If it's mounted across like this, that means it has a longboard. But if it's mounted the other way, over to the left, like this, that means you have a shortboard. So here are two SID chips, SID standing for Sound Interface Device, and it's what gave the Commodore 64 such awesome sound capabilities back in the day. The one on the left is from an older 64, and the one on the right is from my shortboard 64C. Notice anything different? Even though they perform the same functions, the one on the left is a 6581 and the one on the right is an 8580. Same is true for the video chip. The one from the older 64 is a 6567, whereas the one from the newer 64 is the 8562. And even the CPU has a different number. The older 64 used the 6510 CPU, which is a variant of the 6502, whereas the shortboard 64C has the 8500 CPU. So what gives? It all boils down to the fact that the chips in the older 64 breadbins and the longboard 64Cs were made using the NMOS process, whereas the shortboard 64C uses HMOS chips. So the NMOS chips all start with 65, and the HMOS chips all start with 85. These newer chips have the benefit of being more reliable, and they use less power. The newer 85 series chips don't really affect compatibility or user experience all that much, except for when it comes to the SID chip, which sounds a bit different on shortboard 64Cs compared to earlier models. Here's one of my all-time favorite games to play on the C64, and the difference in the sound is quite noticeable with this one. Here's an example of where it's a bit less noticeable. Here is what is probably my all-time favorite C64 demo. It's called Twist of Style by Style, and it's my favorite due in large part to the awesome music that it has, and thankfully it sounds pretty good on both SID chips. Here's another awesome demo with some great music. So overall, the original SID chip has a sort of more full and rich sound when compared to the newer SID chip. The newer SID chip just sounds thinner, and I prefer the older SID chip with the more sort of full and saturated sound, and I consider the 6581 to be the definitive SID chip. And that's why I like the Longboard 64C specifically, because it has a newer, sleeker case, but was still the classic sounding SID chip. So it definitely is worth noting that there are quite a number of 64Cs out there which have the older style SID chip. Oh, and if you're wondering, the Commodore 128 could have either or. Most of the earlier flat model 128s had the 6581 SID chip, but the later ones like the metal case, C128 DCR, those all had the new SID chip. Now let's talk documentation. The original breadbin Commodore 64 came with a manual like this. There were several different variations of the cover. This is one of the earlier ones. This one was printed around 1983 or so. There's quite a bit of information in here. The first little bit runs you through setting up the computer, and pretty much the rest of it is all about programming in BASIC. And there's tons of little example programs, and it does a pretty good job of just walking you through how to program and take advantage of several of the features of the Commodore 64, such as the sprites and SID chip. When the 64C came along, Commodore did revise the documentation a bit. The manual was split into two separate manuals, the first one being the Commodore 64 Introductory Guide, which was a relatively thin book which just sort of walked you through setting up the 64 hardware. And I think it's a bit more detailed, and it has, actual pictures instead of just crude line art. So this just walks you through like the very bare basics of setting up and using the computer. And then we have the Commodore 64C System Guide, Learning to Program in BASIC 2.0, although the formatting is a little bit different, and the contents of this is more or less the same as the breadbin manual. I think a couple things were changed, like for example the sprite demo in the breadbin manual has this Commodore balloon, whereas the sprite demo in the 64C manual just has a smiley face for the example sprite. Neither of these manuals should be confused with the Commodore 64 Programmer's Reference Guide, which I sometimes see referred to as the C64 manual, but this is different from the manual that came with the 64. It is quite a bit more detailed, and it goes beyond just programming in BASIC, and it contains lots of really detailed memory maps, and it even has information on things like the individual CPU instructions. The Commodore 64 Programmer's Reference Guide is a piece of official first-party documentation written and published by Commodore, but it was a separate purchase and was not included with the computer. There are a couple of fairly rare variations of the Commodore 64 breadbin and 64C, which I didn't talk about because they're quite rare. That first one being the Silver Label 64. These are pretty rare, and these are basically the first 80,000 C64s ever produced back in 1982, and they're called the Silver Label 64 because they have a silver Commodore logo, and they don't have the rainbow on them. And it just says, over here it just says Commodore, and then it says 64 over by the power LED. And there are a few other sort of quirks of these machines. I'd love to get one someday. There's also this Commodore 64C CR. These are also very rare, and these were produced right towards the absolute very end of the C64's time on the market. Here's a picture of one. apparently it's held together with clips and not screws, and there's no sticker for the label. It's actually molded into the plastic, so that's like super extremely cost reduced. These are also quite rare from what I gather. Okay, so that's just about it for this video. I know I didn't exactly cover every single possible variation and inconsistency with the C64, because I know there were lots of just tiny little changes that they made throughout the C64's lifespan, and Commodore wasn't exactly known for being consistent when building their machines. They would just sort of throw whatever they had lying around together. So there are lots of little variations and inconsistencies when it comes to the C64. And honestly, just with Commodore machines in general. And yeah, that's pretty much it for this video. I've said Commodore 64 quite a few times. I think the most I've ever said it in one video. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. Oh yeah, and I also have a Discord. I've had it for a while, but I haven't really promoted it much, and it's not really that active, but just FYI, you can find the link to it in my About section if you're interested.